Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a million again for joining us for the sixth video in our series on burnout. Different background today, over with the team in London. So happy to be able to take some time to bring you the seminar. So today we're looking at what's probably going to be the last of the kind of big symptoms that we see with burnout, and we're going to move then on to what we can actually do about it as we go on through the next few seminars. And today we're looking at burnout and poor decisions. So it's the kind of thing that people have experienced a lot. I imagine, again, even yesterday we were doing a workshop and it became one of those recurring themes of people making poor decisions and deciding on things that they regret later on. And we often assume that it's some kind of a problem with intelligence or problem with the amount of information we have or some kind of poor judgment that we might have. But when it comes to burnout, it takes us back to that recurring theme that we've seen over and over again, which is it's dependent on the brain state in which you find yourself and when those decisions have to be made. And what we're trying to get away from is this idea of these poor decisions being some kind of a personal failure and more about understandable consequences of what you might call an overloaded brain. So it's useful then to start with experience rather than with teaching, as it were. So to think of a time, and they're often very easy to get to bring to mind, is think about a time that you kind of rushed an email or rushed a WhatsApp response and you kind of later regretted it, or you bought something impulsively, you forgot something obvious, or this is one that resonates particularly with people is you agreed to do something that you shouldn't have agreed to, even when at the time you knew you really didn't want to do it, but you kind of felt this compulsion that you should really get, give the answer yes. Or, you make a decision that kind of feels sensible in the moment, taking on more work or taking on more caring duties or whatever it might be. And then you end up regretting it afterwards. But it's useful just to think of that one thing, and we'll revisit this later on. And again, we use this kind of juxtaposed versions of yourself. And you imagine in that moment the two different versions of yourself, that well-rested, clear-headed, slightly empowered version of yourself versus the exhausted, behind schedule, haggard and hassled version of yourself being presented with this choice, this decision that you have to make, or maybe a request for help that somebody might give you. So again, you might end up in that hassled version of yourself, just kind of agreeing to get past the problem. But in that more rested version of yourself, it doesn't even have to be an outright no, for instance. It can often be just that sense of a little bit more control over your response, which might be, yeah, let me think about it. Or can I get back to you about that tomorrow? Or, oh no, I don't normally take meetings after 5 p.m. or whatever it might be. And again, it comes back to the same person, same decision, more or less the same everything, but the different brain state into which information is arriving. And that brain state, of course, being a byproduct of this burnout process that we're talking about. And it's useful to think back to this concept of your brain as an organism and a mechanism of finite resources. And when you overload it takes shortcuts and it builds habits that make the allocation of resources easier. So every decision you make, of course, relies on the utilization of brain capacity, attention, working memory. And a big one that draws down a lot of the battery power, as it were, is the capacity for inhibition, the capacity to stop ourselves from doing things, from acting impulsively and planning ahead and thinking through the consequences of actions. These are often prefrontal cortex activations, and they require a lot of brain power, as it were. They're largely supported then by this prefrontal cortex or networks associated with the prefrontal cortex. And burnout, prolonged pressure, prolonged stress, and inadequate recovery then deplete and reduce the efficiency of these neural networks. So it's not that your brain has any sort of particular problem with it. It's just that you have fewer resources from which you can draw in order to activate these kind of resource heavy functions. Then we come upon this problem of decision fatigue, because these things then start to stack up on top of each other. Most of the decisions you make during the day are really tiny. we're talking about things like, are you going to have a tea or a coffee? You're going to open this email. Should you reply to that WhatsApp now or reply later? Every decision you have takes a small amount of cognitive effort, but we know that sense, that feeling we get when you are completely and utterly overwhelmed by decisions, that small decisions then begin to start taking up a lot of this cognitive space. When your resources are reduced through burnout, these additional decisions become harder. And that's what's called decision fatigue. And it's one of the characteristic things of burnout. And the key thing I often keep making this distinction is the difference between kind of a lack of intelligence or lack of information or a kind of moral discipline versus an overloaded brain that is having its resources depleted. You've got this kind of access to fewer mental resources, as it were. And that is because when we reduce and deplete our resources, our brain is very, very good at running templates. Your brain adapts very quickly to kind of scarce resources. It relies less on this very resource heavy, deliberate, slow processing of information. And instead, it uses faster, more automatic processes. Now, under normal circumstances, that's generally quite fine. But if you think about something like tying your shoelaces, there was a point in your life where you had to very deliberately, consciously allocate resources to every step in that. But as you get better at it, you begin to push those steps down into non-conscious brain areas, the basal ganglia in particular, for planned, rehearsed motor activation. A little bit the same with putting on a seatbelt in the car. You generally don't remember doing it. It just becomes this automatic thing. And you notice how automatic it is if you ever end up driving on the other side of the road where your seatbelt's on the other side. You begin to see how hard it is to override an automatic process. But when your brain is tired, its capacity to make decisions using slow, deliberate, resource-heavy brain areas becomes harder and harder, and you begin to rely on old habits and more automated processes. Shortcuts become really attractive for your brain when you've got limited resources, and immediate rewards become much more attractive and appealing than long-term benefits. So you get this kind of impulsivity. And it's not laziness. It's just your brain really trying to conserve very limited resources that it has, which is a normal, natural thing to do. But those resources become depleted by this constant pressure, constant strain, and the lack of recovery. So your brain stops asking a question which is more adaptive for you. That is, what's the best thing for me? And it shifts more towards this the question of what's the easiest thing I can do right now. And that's probably the key question upon which today's seminar hangs, is if your brain is mentally fresh and you have resources and you have recovery, you will ask the very logical question, of course, what's the best decision for me right now? But when you're exhausted, you get this kind of subtle change, which is, oh, what's the easiest thing just to get me through this right now? And that might be just saying yes, just agreeing, fawning to the demands of other people around us so that we can just get past this decision right now. And that, can be avoidance, it can be delaying things, all of those kind of things. It makes it easy now, and it's pushing the magnitude of the work down later. These are the kind of decisions that exhausted brains make. And then when you look at the literature, and of course this, I'm sure, tallies with people's personal experience, burnout then is associated with increased errors, poorer judgment, impulsive choices, reduced cognitive flexibility, and greater reliance on routines. And of course, you people with burnout will often report this kind of sense of the robotic nature of life, that life just loses meaning, it loses its kind of color, and you become this kind of robot where you just get into routines, you do things, you're not thinking about it, you're just making the easy decisions to keep surviving for the day. Again, this is not about capability. This is not about your intelligence or your capacity in that respect. It's about a brain whose resources are fewer, and then the prefrontal cortex and related networks, which allocate those resources, have fewer resources to allocate. So you end up then having to rely on other brain areas which don't have the capacity for this more slow, more deliberate, more nuanced cognitive processing. So what helps with that? And like a lot of the things we've discussed through the weeks, and again, we discussed this at the seminar yesterday here in London, is slow, simple steps over time always win out. So how can you do things like reduce the amount of decisions you have to make in a day that are consequential? One of the biggest mistakes we make is that we assume that every decision we have to make has to be made immediately. Research suggests that reducing this kind of unnecessary decision load where possible is really beneficial. Also, try to, if you can and where it's possible, postpone important decisions until you know that you might be in a better brain state for doing that. And that's often after sleep, so earlier in the day rather than later. But of course, the key thing is about recognition. So we often say recognition comes before regulation. So if you took nothing else from today, nothing else at all, in fact, if you could get to the point where you can say, I recognize that right now is not a good time for me to make this decision. I recognize at 11 p.m. on my phone with my feet up on the couch and the TV's on in the background, this is not a good time to make this decision. If you don't do anything else, you don't have to worry about regulating yourself, any of that. You can recognize that and say, maybe I'll make this decision in the morning. That's a really powerful habit that you can get into. And you'll know people who are really good at that. Some people who say, look, I'm feeling a bit cross now. I'm feeling a bit angry now. I'm feeling a bit tired. I'll reply to that in the morning. Or I'll answer that question in the morning. That recognition is a large part of what eventually becomes regulation. And something I have seen colleagues doing that I would never have thought to do was blocking out conscious thinking time. And I know it sounds a little bit contrived, but sometimes if you can say to yourself, recognize you're in the wrong state for a good decision and say, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take 20 minutes and I'm just going to walk 10 minutes in this direction and 10 minutes back. And in that, I'm not going to bring my mobile phone. I'm just going to walk and I'm not going to solve the problem, but I'm going to take 10 minutes to think that way and 10 minutes to think back this way and then come back. You'll be amazed. Again, it's small, it's simple, but you'll be amazed if you do that repeatedly, how the quality and timbre of your decision starts to change. Back to that key principle. Burnout doesn't reduce your intelligence, although it can feel like you're getting completely overwhelmed and you're losing your capacity and you're losing your cognitive capacity and your decision making and your intelligence and your capacity for connection. It all comes back to that brain state. It's when you become frustrated then with yourself because you know you are capable of making better decisions. You know that you are capable of managing all this workload and this cognitive load, but you're getting that really increased sense of inefficiency and inadequacy. And then you get into the cycle where it's difficult to make decisions and then you become frustrated. And the frustration then becomes part of the difficulty that people experience. It's just your brain is not operating under those conditions where efficiency becomes possible. It's worth thinking about that just for 1 second. We often find ourselves in conditions which prevent our brain from operating effectively. And that's where some little simple things that we can do repeatedly, like blocking out time to think. Most of us don't do that because we think we're doing it all the time. But there's so much distraction and so much pressure. If we can block out little moments where we say, that's just thinking time for me. 10 minutes this way, 10 minutes that way. It's not a lot, but you'll get a lot of benefit from doing that repeatedly. Again, one thing I like to always stress, no matter which seminar I'm giving or which group I'm talking to, part of the process is about starting off with the basic premise that it's just the same, you're the same person, you're the same brain, but it's a different state. Remember, it's just information arriving into your brain under different conditions. And that can then create all of these difficult outcomes for us. So it's about trying to understand the conditions in which we find ourselves, and that becomes about regulation. So we're going to very quickly, as we move on to the next few weeks, and we round down our series on burnout, we're going to start talking much more now about what we can actually go ahead and do with it, do about it, how we can end up in recovery. We're finished looking at these kind of symptoms. We're going to go on to make things a little bit more hopeful, and that's this concept of recovery. What actually happens inside your brain when pressure begins to reduce? How quickly does recovery begin? Why do some people bounce back faster than other people? Some people take a little bit longer to get into this recovery. And more importantly, or most importantly for us, is what does the evidence tell us about how our brain recovers? And that's going to be the theme of the next few. Just to let you know, the last couple of weeks of seminars are now available online as well. So we'll be distributing a link to that later on. And we're going to have all of our burnout series available online. So there's we're on week 6 now. So there'll be week 7, 8, and 9. We have 3 more on burnout. So thank you very much again. I know it's super duper hot and everyone's suffering with the heat. So thanks a million for joining us again today. And I hope I'll get to see you all again next week for the beginning of the more hopeful side of burnout, which is recovery. So again, thanks a million. And we'll distribute the link for the invite for next week and the repository of all the videos up to this point. Thanks again. Bye-bye.